Where is the man who gave away his last meal? The question echoed across the frozen town square, and for a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. 6 olive-green military vehicles stood in a perfect line beneath the pale winter sun, their engines humming softly as thin clouds drifted across the Nebraska sky. Residents pressed against storefront windows. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. The entire town seemed suspended between disbelief and curiosity. At the center of it all stood a woman in a dark military dress coat. Her posture was straight, her expression calm. Her eyes searched the crowd with quiet determination. "I'm looking for Ethan Walker," she said again. "Can someone tell me where to find him?" A low murmur spread through the gathering. Ethan Walker. Everyone knew that name. Most people in Pine Hollow knew everyone's name. It was the kind of town where mail carriers knew birthdays, where waitresses remembered coffee orders, and where news traveled faster than the wind rolling across the cornfields. Yet hearing Ethan's name connected to a military convoy made no sense at all. Ethan wasn't a politician. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't some decorated celebrity returning home. He was just a struggling single dad trying to survive another winter. A mechanic who repaired farm equipment when work was available and fixed whatever neighbors could afford when it wasn't. A man whose old pickup rattled louder every month and whose boots had been resoled so many times they barely resembled the originals. The woman's gaze moved across the crowd. Patient. Steady. Waiting. "You're looking for Ethan?" asked Mr. Jensen, owner of the hardware store. "That's right. What exactly did he do?" The woman smiled faintly. Not the smile of someone amused. The smile of someone remembering something important. Something personal. 7 days ago, she said quietly, "he saved me." The crowd exchanged puzzled looks. Saved her? Some people frowned. Others glanced toward the convoy. One teenager lowered his phone. An elderly couple leaned closer together. Nobody understood. The woman looked toward the edge of town, where a narrow road curved between snow-covered fields. "He probably doesn't even realize it," she continued. "That's the kind of man he is." Silence settled again. Heavy, curious, respectful. Then the woman took a slow breath and looked toward the horizon. "I was hungry," she said. "Cold, exhausted, alone. And he gave me the last meal he had." The words landed softly, yet somehow carried more weight than any speech could have. Several people lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably, because now they remembered. They remembered seeing Ethan that afternoon. They remembered the homeless woman sitting near the old bus shelter at the edge of town. And they remembered laughing. Not everyone, but enough. They remembered shaking their heads when Ethan stopped beside her. Remembered muttering that he could barely feed himself. Remembered saying he should worry about his daughter before worrying about strangers. The woman looked down briefly before lifting her eyes again. "Most people walked past me." Her voice remained calm. "He didn't." A cold breeze swept across the square, carrying flakes of old snow along the pavement. Somewhere a church bell rang once, then faded. The woman's eyes softened. "I never told him who I was." Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. "He sat beside me." She paused. "He asked if I was okay." Her gaze drifted toward the distant road again. "And when I told him I was hungry, he opened a paper bag." A faint smile touched her lips. Inside was a sandwich. Probably the only decent meal he had all day. The crowd remained frozen, listening. He split it in half. She swallowed gently. Then he gave me the larger piece. Several heads lowered. A few people exchanged guilty looks. The woman stood quietly for a moment before continuing. That simple act of kindness changed more lives than he could ever imagine. Her words lingered in the winter air. Then she looked back toward the crowd. "So I'll ask one more time." Her voice remained steady, but now there was unmistakable warmth behind it. "Where can I find Ethan Walker?" And as the town stood speechless beneath the pale morning sky, nobody yet knew that this was only the beginning of a story that would leave Pine Hollow silent for years to come. 7 days earlier, long before military vehicles rolled into Pine Hollow, and long before anyone spoke Ethan Walker's name with curiosity instead of sympathy, the town looked exactly the way it always did in late January. Gray clouds hung low over the Nebraska plains. Thin layers of snow-covered fence posts and rooftops. The wind moved across empty fields with a lonely whistle that seemed to find every crack and corner. Ethan pulled his old pickup into the gravel driveway of a weathered farmhouse and switched off the engine. For a few seconds, he sat quietly behind the wheel, staring at the fuel gauge hovering just above empty. He rubbed a hand across his tired face and glanced at the folded invoice resting on the passenger seat. The repair job had paid less than expected. Again, he exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered to himself, it is still something. The words sounded more hopeful than he felt. When he arrived home that evening, the small house sat beneath a fading orange sky. Warm light glowed through the kitchen window. The sight always made his shoulders relax a little. No matter how difficult life became, that light meant Sophie was waiting inside. The front door opened before he reached the porch. "Daddy," Sophie called. Her blonde hair bounced as she rushed outside wearing an oversized winter sweater. "You are home." Ethan smiled despite the weight pressing on his chest. "Looks like it." She wrapped her arms around him. "Did you fix the tractor?" "I did." "Did they pay you?" Ethan hesitated just long enough for Sophie to notice. "Some of it." Sophie nodded as if she understood more than a 9-year-old should. In many ways, she did. Since her mother passed away 4 years earlier, life had taught her lessons most children never had to learn. Together they stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of tomato soup and fresh bread. Not because there was bread, only because Sophie had lit a scented candle she found at a thrift store months earlier. Ethan smiled when he noticed it. "Trying to make the place fancy?" Sophie grinned. "It is working." Ethan laughed softly. Moments like these mattered. Small moments. Quiet moments. The kind that helped people survive difficult seasons. He set the grocery bag on the counter and began unloading the contents. A carton of milk, a can of soup, a package of crackers. Sophie watched carefully. Then she asked the question Ethan had been hoping she would not ask. "Is that everything?" The room fell silent. Ethan forced a smile. "For now." Sophie looked down. She never complained. That somehow made it harder. Ethan walked to the refrigerator and opened it. The shelves were nearly empty. A few eggs, some leftover soup, half a bottle of ketchup. He stared for a second before quietly closing the door. Outside, the wind rattled the kitchen window. Inside, the old furnace clicked and groaned as it struggled to keep up with the cold. Bills sat stacked on the corner of the counter. Electric bill, mortgage notice, insurance payment. Each one seemed louder than the last. Ethan looked away from them and focused on Sophie instead. "How was school?" he asked. "Good. Just good." Sophie shrugged. "We talked about heroes today." Ethan smiled. "That sounds interesting." Sophie climbed onto a chair. "Mrs. Henderson asked everyone who their hero was. And most kids picked athletes." "Makes sense." Sophie studied him carefully. "I picked you." Ethan froze. For a moment, he could not find words. Sophie continued before he could respond. Some kids laughed. Her voice remained calm. "They said heroes are famous." Ethan walked over and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "You know something?" Sophie looked up. "What?" "Most real heroes are not famous." Sophie smiled. "That is what I told them." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Pride. Gratitude. Maybe a little heartbreak, too. The sky outside darkened as evening settled across Pine Hollow. Snow drifted against the windows. The house creaked softly. Sophie finished her homework while Ethan sat at the kitchen table, studying numbers that refused to work. He adjusted them once. Then again. Still impossible. He was deciding which bill would have to wait when Sophie suddenly spoke. "Mom used to say something." Ethan looked up. "What was that?" Sophie smiled faintly. She said, "If life ever gets hard, do not let it make your heart smaller." The room became very still. Ethan looked toward the framed photograph resting on the shelf above the fireplace. His late wife smiled back from another time. Another life. Another season filled with laughter. "That sounds like her," he said quietly. Sophie nodded. "I think she was right." Ethan stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked back at his daughter. Outside, the winter wind howled across the empty fields. Inside, something stronger remained. Not certainty, not comfort, just quiet dignity. The kind that survives when everything else becomes difficult. Neither of them knew that by this time tomorrow, one simple choice would begin changing their lives forever. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of pale gray clouds that stretched from one end of the Nebraska horizon to the other. Ethan Walker woke before sunrise as he always did. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rattle of winter wind against the siding. For a few moments he lay still, staring at the ceiling. Some mornings began with energy. Others began with responsibility. This one began with arithmetic. Numbers. Bills. Deadlines. The kinds of things that followed a man even into his dreams. He sat up slowly and reached for the small notebook on the nightstand. Under the glow of a lamp, he reviewed the figures again. Mortgage payment due in 11 days. Electric bill due in 6. Truck insurance due next week. The total sitting in his checking account was smaller than any of them. Ethan closed the notebook and rubbed his eyes. He had spent years learning that worry solved very little. Still, some burdens insisted on making themselves heard. A soft knock sounded at the doorway. "You awake?" Sophie asked. Ethan smiled immediately. "I think so." She stepped inside wearing fuzzy socks and carrying a bowl of cereal. "I saved the last banana for you." Ethan looked at the bowl and laughed quietly. "That is a pretty generous offer." "I know." She grinned. "I am making sacrifices." Ethan accepted the banana with exaggerated gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Walker." Sophie climbed onto the edge of the bed. "Did you sleep okay?" Ethan hesitated. "Enough." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "That means no. That means I am thinking. About money?" Ethan looked at her. Sometimes he forgot she was only 9 years old. "A little." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Mom used to think too much when she was worried." Ethan smiled. "Your mother thought about everything. Then maybe you should do what she did." "And what was that?" Sophie shrugged. "Help somebody." Ethan blinked. Help somebody. Whenever she got worried, she helped someone else. Sophie smiled. She said it reminded her the world was bigger than her problems. Ethan sat quietly. The words lingered longer than expected. After breakfast, he drove Sophie to school. Snow crunched beneath tires as parents dropped children near the front entrance. Teachers waved from the sidewalk, bundled in heavy coats. Sophie gathered her backpack and opened the truck door. Then she paused. "Daddy." "Yeah. Things are going to get better." Ethan looked at her. "You sound pretty sure." Sophie smiled. "I am." Then she climbed out and disappeared into the stream of students. Ethan remained parked for a moment after she was gone. He wished certainty came as naturally to adults as it did to children. The day moved slowly after that. 2 repair appointments canceled because of weather. Another customer delayed payment until spring. By early afternoon, Ethan had earned exactly $0. The old pickup rolled through town beneath a sky, threatening more snow. Pine Hollow looked sleepy and cold. A few shoppers hurried along Main Street carrying bags. The diner windows glowed warmly. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Everything appeared peaceful from a distance. Yet Ethan knew many families were carrying burdens of their own. That was life. Most people fought battles nobody else could see. He parked near a small grocery store and checked the cash in his wallet. $23. That was all. Enough for a few essentials. Not enough for comfort. Not enough for security. Still, enough to get through another day. Inside the store, he moved carefully through the aisles. A loaf of bread. A carton of milk. Soup. Peanut butter. He calculated every item before placing it into the basket. At the checkout counter, the total flashed across the screen. Ethan handed over the bills without complaint. The cashier smiled sympathetically. "Hang in there, Ethan. Always do." He carried the groceries outside and loaded them into the truck. Then he noticed something. Across the street, near the old bus shelter at the edge of town, someone sat alone on a bench. At first, he barely paid attention. Pine Hollow occasionally saw travelers passing through. But something about the figure felt different. The woman wore a worn coat several sizes too large. Her shoulders were hunched against the cold. Snowflakes gathered on her sleeves. Beside her sat a small duffel bag that looked as though it had traveled many miles. People walked past without stopping. Cars drove by without slowing. The woman simply remained there staring at the road ahead. Ethan watched for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked away and started the truck. The engine turned over with a rough cough. He shifted into gear. But as he prepared to leave, Sophie's words returned unexpectedly. "Help somebody." Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The truck idled softly. The wind pushed loose snow across the pavement. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he found himself looking back toward the bus shelter one more time. Ethan sat motionless for several seconds while the truck idled beside the curb. The heater pushed weak streams of warm air through aging vents, barely keeping the windshield clear. Outside, snow drifted lazily through the gray afternoon light. People continued walking past the bus shelter without slowing down. A delivery truck rolled through the intersection. A mother hurried 2 children across the street. Life moved forward the way it always did. Yet the woman remained exactly where she was. Alone. Waiting. Ethan glanced toward the grocery bags resting on the passenger seat. Then he looked back at the shelter. "Come on," he muttered to himself. "You have enough problems already." He shifted into drive. The truck moved forward a few feet, then stopped. Ethan sighed. Sophie's voice echoed inside his mind again. "Help! Somebody!" He closed his eyes briefly before turning the steering wheel. Moments later, the truck pulled alongside the shelter. The woman looked up as he stepped out. Up close, she appeared older than he first thought, perhaps late 30s or early 40s. Her face carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent too many nights sleeping wherever she could find shelter. Loose strands of blonde hair escaped from beneath a knit cap. Her hands were tucked deep inside worn gloves. Despite her condition, there was something unusual about her posture. Something composed. Something steady. It was difficult to explain. "Ma'am?" Ethan asked gently. The woman turned toward him. Her blue eyes met his. Alert. Intelligent. Far more observant than he expected. "Yes." Her voice was calm but tired. "Are you okay?" A faint smile crossed her face. "That depends on how you define okay." Ethan nodded. "Fair answer." For a moment neither spoke. Wind moved through the shelter, rattling loose advertisements attached to the side panel. Finally, Ethan gestured toward the empty road. "Are you waiting for a bus?" Supposedly. Supposedly. She glanced down the highway. The last one never came. Ethan looked at the darkening sky. "Another one is not coming today either. I figured that out about an hour ago." Ethan smiled despite himself. The woman smiled back briefly. Then the silence returned. Not awkward, just quiet. The kind of silence shared by people carrying burdens they did not discuss. Ethan noticed the duffel bag beside her. It looked old, but carefully maintained. Everything about her seemed that way. Worn but disciplined. Tired but composed. "Have you eaten?" he asked. The woman hesitated. That hesitation told him everything. "Not today." Ethan guessed. "Not today." He looked toward the truck again. A loaf of bread. Milk. Peanut butter. A few essentials. Nothing extra. His wallet contained almost nothing. The logical choice was obvious. Drive home. Protect what little remained. Focus on Sophie. Focus on survival. Nobody would blame him. Yet something inside refused to let him walk away. The woman seemed to notice the conflict in his expression. "You do not have to worry about me," she said quietly. "I have managed worse." Ethan laughed softly. "You know what?" "What?" "That sounds exactly like something people say when they definitely need help." For the first time, genuine amusement appeared in her eyes. It lasted only a second before fading. Ethan walked back to the truck and reached into a paper bag resting on the passenger seat. Earlier that morning, he had packed himself a sandwich. Turkey. Cheese. Nothing special. It was supposed to be dinner. His only real meal until the next day. He stared at it for a moment. Then he carried it back to the shelter. The woman immediately shook her head. "No," Ethan held it out anyway. "You need this more than I do. You do not know that." "Actually, I think I do." She looked at the sandwich but made no move to take it. "What about you?" Ethan shrugged. "I will survive." "You sound very certain." Ethan smiled faintly. "My daughter would tell you I am not allowed to quit." The woman studied him carefully. There was something in her expression now. Respect perhaps. Or curiosity. Slowly she accepted the sandwich. Her gloved hands trembled slightly from the cold. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome." Ethan sat beside her on the bench. Snow continued falling around them. Traffic remained light. The town seemed quieter than usual. The woman unwrapped the sandwich and looked down at it for a moment before taking a bite. She closed her eyes briefly. Not dramatically, simply with gratitude. Ethan looked away to give her privacy. After a few moments, she spoke again. "Most people would have kept walking. Most people have enough reasons to worry about themselves. And you do not." Ethan laughed softly. "Trust me, I have plenty." The woman turned toward him. "Then why stop?" Ethan thought about that. About Sophie. About his wife. About every difficult year that had shaped him. Finally he answered. "Because somebody once taught me not to let hard times make my heart smaller." The woman stared at him. For a moment her expression changed completely, as though those words had reached somewhere deep inside her. Then she looked down and nodded quietly. Neither of them noticed the black SUV parked half a block away for less than 30 seconds before driving on. The woman finished the sandwich slowly, as though she wanted every bite to last. Ethan sat quietly beside her while snow drifted across the empty street. Neither felt the need to fill the silence. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations happened between the words. A pickup truck rolled past the shelter. The driver glanced toward them and shook his head before continuing down the road. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. He had lived in a small town long enough to understand how quickly people formed opinions with only half the story. The woman folded the sandwich wrapper neatly and placed it inside her coat pocket. Even that small gesture seemed deliberate, disciplined, careful. Ethan found himself wondering who she really was before life brought her to this bus shelter. "You have family?" he asked gently. The woman looked toward the horizon before answering. "Somewhere." Ethan nodded. "That sounds complicated." "It is." Another quiet moment passed. Then she turned toward him. "What about you?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Just me and my daughter." "How old?" 9. A warmth entered his voice immediately, the kind of warmth that only appeared when he spoke about Sophie. The woman noticed. "You are proud of her." Ethan laughed softly. "More than she knows." "What is she like?" Ethan leaned back against the cold bench. "Kind." He smiled. "Stubborn too." "That sounds dangerous." "It absolutely is." The woman laughed quietly. The sound surprised both of them. For the first time, some of the exhaustion seemed to lift from her face. Ethan continued. "She still believes the world is full of good people." "And you?" Ethan looked toward the falling snow. "I think I believe that because of her." The woman studied him carefully. There was no self-pity in his voice. No bitterness. Only honesty. That seemed to interest her more than anything else. "Life has not been easy for you," she said. It was not a question. Ethan shrugged. "Life has not been easy for a lot of people." "That is not what I asked." Ethan smiled. "Then no, it has not." The woman nodded slowly. "Yet you still stopped." Ethan laughed again. "You really keep coming back to that." "Because I am trying to understand it." The wind picked up briefly, carrying loose snow across the road. A traffic light changed from red to green, even though no cars waited at the intersection. The town felt almost frozen in time. Ethan looked at the woman for a moment before speaking. "My wife used to tell me something." "What was that?" "She said kindness only matters when it costs you something." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly as she considered the words. "That is a difficult way to live." "Maybe." Ethan smiled. But she was usually right. For a moment the woman looked away. Her expression shifted. Something deeper moved behind her eyes. A memory perhaps. Or a regret. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small silver object attached to a chain. Ethan only caught a brief glimpse before she closed her hand around it again. It looked old. Valuable perhaps. Yet she held it less like an expensive possession and more like a reminder. "Someone once told me something similar," she said quietly. Ethan waited. "They said character is what remains after everything else is taken away." Ethan nodded. "That sounds true." The woman smiled faintly. "I hope so." Snow continued falling as daylight slowly faded. The temperature dropped another few degrees. Ethan glanced at the darkening sky. "You cannot stay out here tonight." The woman immediately shook her head. "I will manage." "Not in this weather. I have been through worse." Ethan sighed. "There is that phrase again." The woman almost smiled. "Old habits." Ethan stood and brushed snow from his coat. "Come on." "What?" "The diner is still open." "I already ate." "Good." Ethan pointed toward the warm lights glowing across the street. "Then you can have coffee." The woman hesitated. "You do not have to do that." "Probably not." "Then why?" Ethan looked at her as though the answer were obvious. "Because nobody should face winter alone." The woman stared at him. Really stared at him. Not as a stranger. Not as someone handing out charity. But as if she were seeing something she had not seen in a very long time. Respect. Grace. Quiet strength. The things money could not buy and status could not command. Finally she stood. "All right," she said softly. Together they crossed the street toward the diner. Neither noticed a man sitting inside a dark SUV parked farther down Main Street. He lowered a pair of binoculars and spoke briefly into a phone before the vehicle pulled away. Inside the diner, warm yellow lights spilled across polished floors and fogged windows. The smell of coffee and fresh pie filled the air. As Ethan held the door open for the woman, several people looked up from their booths. Conversation slowed. Curious eyes followed them. Ethan barely noticed. The woman did. Yet for reasons she could not explain, walking through that door beside him felt safer than it had felt to trust anyone in a very long time. The diner had always been the heart of Pine Hollow. Farmers gathered there before sunrise. Teachers stopped in after school. Retirees claimed the same corner booths every afternoon. On most days it felt warm and welcoming. Tonight, however, the atmosphere shifted the moment Ethan and the woman walked through the door together. Conversations softened. Eyes followed them. Curiosity spread quietly from table to table. Ethan barely noticed. He was too busy brushing snow from his shoulders. The woman noticed every glance. Years of experience had taught her how to read a room within seconds. "Pick anywhere," Ethan said. "I am not picky." They settled into a booth near the window. Outside, snowflakes drifted beneath the yellow glow of streetlights. Inside, the scent of coffee and cinnamon filled the air. A waitress named Carol approached carrying 2 menus. She smiled at Ethan before glancing toward his guest. "Evening, Ethan." "Evening, Carol." Her eyes lingered on the woman for a second longer than necessary. "Coffee, please," Ethan said. Carol nodded and walked away. The woman watched her go. "Friendly town." Ethan smiled. Usually. Small towns come with benefits." He shrugged. "And opinions." The woman almost laughed. "Fair enough." Across the room, 2 men sitting near the counter whispered to each other. Ethan recognized them immediately. Larry Benson and Rick Porter. Both spent more time discussing other people's lives than managing their own. Larry leaned closer to Rick and muttered something. Rick chuckled. Neither seemed concerned about being overheard. Looks like Ethan found himself a project. More laughter followed. Ethan pretended not to hear. The woman heard every word. Carol returned with coffee. Steam curled from the mugs. Warmth filled the small space between them. The woman wrapped both hands around her cup. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee?" Ethan asked. "For not reacting." Ethan glanced toward the counter. "People talk. Does it not bother you?" Ethan considered the question. "Sometimes." He stirred his coffee slowly. "But carrying anger is expensive. I cannot afford it." The woman smiled faintly. "That is an interesting philosophy. It is mostly survival." A few booths away, another voice rose louder than intended. "Man cannot even pay his own bills." Someone snickered. "Now he is buying dinner for strangers." The woman lowered her eyes. Ethan simply took another sip of coffee. His calmness seemed almost impossible. "You know they are talking about you," she said quietly. "I know." And Ethan smiled. "And tomorrow they will talk about someone else." For the first time that evening, the woman looked genuinely impressed. The conversation paused when Carol returned with a slice of apple pie. Ethan frowned. "I did not order that." "I know." Carol placed it on the table anyway. "Somebody covered it." "Who?" Carol glanced across the diner. An elderly couple sitting near the fireplace lifted their coffee mugs slightly. Ethan recognized them immediately. Harold and Margaret Collins. Married for 50 years. Kind people. Quiet people. The woman stared at the pie. "Interesting." Ethan smiled. "Small towns come with opinions." He nodded toward the elderly couple. "And sometimes grace." The woman looked at him for a long moment. There was something unusual about this man. He possessed very little. Yet somehow he carried himself like someone who had enough. Enough dignity. Enough patience. Enough kindness. The things most people spent their lives chasing. Outside, a black SUV rolled slowly past the diner. Its headlights reflected briefly against the window before disappearing down Main Street. The woman noticed immediately. Her expression changed for less than a second. Ethan caught it. "Everything okay?" She looked back at him. "Yes." The answer came too quickly. Ethan sensed it, but chose not to push. Everyone carried private battles. Respect meant allowing people to share them in their own time. They talked for another hour. About Nebraska winters. About Sophie. About favorite books. About places neither had ever visited. The woman revealed almost nothing about herself, yet somehow the conversation never felt empty. She listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, occasionally smiled at stories about Sophie. Eventually the diner began closing. Chairs were stacked. Floors were swept. Customers drifted home. Ethan glanced at the clock. "I should get going." The woman nodded. "Your daughter is waiting." They stepped outside together. The cold air hit immediately. Snow had stopped falling, leaving the town covered beneath a quiet white blanket. Streetlights reflected off fresh drifts. The entire world seemed softer somehow. Ethan looked toward the bus shelter. "You can stay at the church shelter tonight." The woman hesitated. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not. You keep saying things like that." Ethan smiled. "Maybe because they are true." The woman stared at him. Then she reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. She scribbled something quickly before handing it to him. Ethan looked down. Only 3 words were written there. "Thank you, Ethan." He looked up again, but the woman was already stepping away into the quiet winter night. For reasons he could not explain, Ethan had the strange feeling that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. And far beyond the edge of town, unseen beneath the dark Nebraska sky, several vehicles changed direction and began moving toward Pine Hollow. Ethan stood beneath the diner's awning for several seconds after the woman disappeared into the snowy darkness. The folded note remained in his hand. "Thank you, Ethan." 3 simple words. Nothing more. Yet something about them felt heavier than they should have. The street was nearly empty now. Snow reflected the pale glow of street lights, turning Main Street into a quiet ribbon of silver stretching through the heart of Pine Hollow. Ethan finally tucked the note into his jacket pocket and headed toward his truck. The engine protested before starting. It always did when temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. As he drove home, the town grew silent around him. Most windows were dark. Porch lights glowed softly against fresh snow. Everything felt peaceful. Yet he could not stop thinking about the woman. He did not know her last name. He did not know where she came from. He did not even know if he would ever see her again. But something about her stayed with him. Something unresolved. When he arrived home, Sophie was already waiting by the living room window. The moment she heard the truck door close, she rushed to open the front door. "You are late," she announced. Ethan smiled. "I noticed. Did you help somebody?" Ethan blinked. "What makes you ask that?" Sophie folded her arms with exaggerated seriousness. "Because that is your face." Ethan laughed. "My face? You're helping somebody face." He shook his head. "I did meet someone." Sophie immediately became interested. "Who?" Ethan stepped inside and removed his coat. "Just a woman passing through town." "Is she okay?" Ethan paused. "I hope so." Sophie nodded thoughtfully, as though filing the information away for later. After a late dinner of soup and crackers, the house settled into its usual evening rhythm. Homework, dishes, quiet conversation. Eventually, Sophie fell asleep on the couch while watching an old movie. Ethan carried her to bed and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. For a moment, he stood in the doorway watching her sleep. Children carried a kind of peace adults often lost. He hoped she would keep it longer than most. The wind outside had strengthened by midnight. Snow brushed against the windows. Tree branches creaked softly in the darkness. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing bills again when headlights flashed briefly across the room. He glanced toward the window. A vehicle had passed the house. Nothing unusual, except it was nearly 1 in the morning. A few minutes later, another pair of headlights appeared, then vanished. Ethan frowned. Pine Hollow was not known for late-night traffic. Curious, he stepped onto the porch. Cold air immediately filled his lungs. The road beyond the property lay mostly empty beneath moonlit snow. Then, in the distance, he noticed something unusual. Several vehicles moving without stopping. Dark, unmarked, traveling quietly along the county road leading away from town. Ethan watched them disappear into the night before eventually returning inside. He told himself it was probably nothing. Yet sleep came slowly. Meanwhile, several miles outside Pine Hollow, hidden beyond a line of snow-covered pines, a small clearing sat beneath the winter sky. The woman stood alone near a parked vehicle. Her posture was no longer weary, no longer uncertain. The exhaustion that had marked her face at the bus shelter seemed replaced by calm focus. A man approached carrying a tablet. "Ma'am." She turned toward him. "Report. The situation is under control." "Good." The man hesitated. "We were concerned when communication stopped." "So was I." A faint smile touched her lips. "Fortunately, some people still believe in helping strangers." The man looked confused but wisely asked no further questions. The woman glanced toward the distant lights of Pine Hollow barely visible on the horizon. "Did anyone identify me?" "No, ma'am." She nodded. "Keep it that way." The man left without another word. The woman remained where she was. Snow drifted through the cold night air. Slowly she reached into her coat pocket and removed something. A photograph. The image had become worn from years of handling. She studied it quietly before looking back toward the distant town. Her expression softened. "You reminded me who we are supposed to be," she whispered. Back in Pine Hollow, dawn arrived beneath a pale blue sky. Ethan woke early and prepared breakfast before driving Sophie to school. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Yet when he passed the bus shelter later that morning, it stood empty. No duffel bag, no footprints, no sign the woman had ever been there. By noon, even the church shelter reported no guest. Matching her description, she had vanished as quietly as she arrived. Most people forgot about her by the next day. Ethan tried to do the same. But every time he reached into his jacket and felt the folded note still resting in the pocket, he found himself wondering where she had gone. What he did not know was that far beyond Pine Hollow, decisions were already being made. Plans were already changing. And several people in positions of tremendous responsibility were asking the same question. Who was Ethan Walker? The next 3 days tested Ethan Walker in ways that had nothing to do with winter weather. Monday brought bad news. Tuesday brought worse news. By Wednesday morning, even his natural optimism felt stretched thin. It began with a phone call just after sunrise. Ethan stood in the kitchen pouring coffee when his cell phone buzzed across the counter. He glanced at the screen and immediately recognized the number. Farm Tech Equipment, one of the largest suppliers in the county. For nearly 2 years, they had provided most of his repair work. Ethan answered with a smile he did not yet realize he would lose. "Good morning." The voice on the other end sounded uncomfortable. "Ethan, I wish I had better news." Within 30 seconds, the conversation was over. Budget cuts, contract changes, repairs moving to a larger company outside the county. Nothing personal, just business. Ethan thanked the manager politely and ended the call. Then he stood silently in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. Snow tapped softly against the window. Somewhere down the hall, Sophie was brushing her teeth before school. Life continued moving forward. Yet one of his most dependable sources of income had vanished. When Sophie entered the kitchen, she immediately noticed something was wrong. "Bad news?" she asked. Ethan managed a smile. "A little." Sophie climbed onto her chair. "How bad?" Ethan looked at her. He had always promised himself he would tell the truth. Not every detail, but the truth. "Work is going to be slower for a while." Sophie thought about that. "Can we still keep the house?" The question landed harder than any bill ever could. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "I am going to do everything I can." Sophie nodded. She trusted him completely. That trust felt both beautiful and terrifying. Later that afternoon, another challenge arrived. Ethan stopped by the mailbox on his way home. Among advertisements and utility notices sat an official envelope from the mortgage company. He already knew what it contained before opening it. The letter was polite, professional, precise. Yet every sentence carried the same message. Time was running short. Ethan folded the notice carefully and slipped it into his jacket. The same jacket where the woman's handwritten note still rested. For reasons he could not explain, his fingers brushed against it before he closed the pocket again. "Thank you, Ethan." 3 simple words. He smiled faintly despite everything. Then he drove home. The next morning brought another surprise. Not the good kind. Sophie climbed into the truck after school with unusual silence. Normally, she filled the ride home with stories about teachers, classmates, and whatever new idea currently occupied her imagination. Today, she stared out the window. Ethan noticed immediately. "Rough day." Sophie shrugged. "Maybe." Ethan waited. Eventually, she spoke. "Some kids said we are poor." Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Not out of anger. Out of sadness. "What did you tell them?" Sophie thought for a moment. "Nothing. Nothing." I did not want to argue. Ethan nodded slowly. "Probably wise." Sophie looked at him. "Are we poor?" The question hung in the truck like a fragile piece of glass. Ethan took a deep breath. "We do not have a lot of money." Sophie nodded. "I know. But being poor is not the most important thing about a person." "Then what is?" Ethan smiled softly. "Character." Sophie immediately grinned. "That is what Mom always said." Ethan laughed. "Your mother was very difficult to disagree with." The conversation seemed to help. Yet later that evening, after Sophie went to bed, Ethan sat alone on the front porch staring across snow-covered fields. The moon illuminated the landscape in silver and blue. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet inside, questions continued piling up. How long could he keep The house. How long before savings disappeared completely? How many more setbacks could they absorb? A distant engine interrupted his thoughts. Ethan looked toward the road. Headlights appeared briefly between rows of trees before disappearing again. Then another set followed. Not unusual enough to be alarming, just unusual enough to be noticed. He watched until the darkness swallowed them completely. Somewhere far beyond Pine Hollow, inside a secure conference room, several people sat around a large table reviewing reports. Photographs appeared on a screen. Names, locations, timelines. Then a picture of Ethan Walker appeared among them. One man looked confused. "This is him." Another nodded. "Yes, sir." A woman sitting at the end of the table studied the image quietly. Her expression remained calm. "And you are certain?" "Absolutely." The room fell silent. Finally, the woman spoke. "Then prepare transportation." Back in Pine Hollow, Ethan had no idea his name was being discussed by people he had never met. He only knew that winter seemed colder than usual and the future felt uncertain. Yet even then, as the wind moved across the empty Nebraska plains and another difficult night settled over the town, something larger had already begun moving toward him. Quietly, deliberately, like dawn approaching long before the first light appears. Thursday morning arrived clear and cold. The storm clouds that had lingered over Nebraska for days had finally moved east, leaving behind a sky so blue it almost looked painted. Frost-coated fences and rooftops. Sunlight sparkled across fields of untouched snow. From a distance, Pine Hollow appeared peaceful. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, strange things were beginning to happen. Ethan noticed the first sign shortly after dropping Sophie off at school. He stopped at Miller's Hardware to pick up a replacement part for a tractor repair job he had managed to secure. As he stepped out of the truck, he saw a dark SUV parked across the street. It was spotless despite the weather. Expensive, unfamiliar, the kind of vehicle rarely seen in a farming town. Ethan barely thought about it until he entered the store. "Morning, Ethan," Mr. Jensen called from behind the counter. "Morning." The older man hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan shrugged. "Sure. You know somebody important?" Ethan laughed. "Not unless they owe me money." Mr. Jensen did not laugh. "Funny thing is, 3 people came in here yesterday asking about you." Ethan blinked. "Me?" One asked where you lived. Another asked where you worked. Third one wanted to know if you had family in town. Ethan frowned. "Who were they?" "Did not say." Mr. Jensen lowered his voice. "But they looked official." Ethan felt a strange sensation settle into his stomach. Not fear, just confusion. "What exactly did you tell them?" "Only that you are a decent man." Ethan smiled faintly. "Well, that narrows things down." Yet the conversation stayed with him. Even more so when he left the store and noticed the SUV was gone. By noon, similar stories began appearing everywhere. Carol from the diner mentioned a well-dressed woman had stopped by asking about Ethan. The school secretary casually mentioned someone had called asking about Sophie. Even Harold Collins, the retired farmer who had bought Ethan pie a few nights earlier, mentioned seeing strangers driving around town. "Maybe you won the lottery," Harold joked. "That would be difficult since I never buy tickets." Harold chuckled. "Then maybe somebody finally noticed you." Ethan smiled politely, but the comment lingered longer than expected. Meanwhile, several hundred miles away inside a secure government facility, the woman Ethan knew only as a traveler sat across from 2 senior officials. Her appearance was completely different now. The worn coat was gone. The exhaustion had disappeared. She wore a neatly pressed uniform that reflected years of service and responsibility. A large screen displayed photographs from Pine Hollow. Ethan's house. Ethan's truck. Sophie leaving school. The woman studied each image quietly. "You confirmed everything?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "And he never asked for anything?" "Nothing." The room grew silent. One official shook his head. "Most people would have." The woman smiled faintly. "That is why most people are not Ethan Walker." Back in Nebraska, Ethan spent the afternoon repairing a combine engine on a neighboring farm. The work helped clear his mind. Machines were simpler than people. Problems had causes. Causes had solutions. Life rarely operated with such clarity. As the sun began setting, he climbed down from the machine and checked his phone. 3 missed calls, all from unknown numbers. He ignored them. Then a text message arrived. "We would like to speak with you regarding an important matter." No name. No explanation. Ethan stared at the message before putting the phone away. "Everything all right?" the farmer asked. Ethan nodded. Probably. But he was no longer certain. That evening, after dinner, Sophie sat at the kitchen table coloring while Ethan reviewed paperwork. The house felt warm despite the cold outside. For a few precious minutes, everything seemed normal. Then headlights appeared outside the window. A vehicle pulled into the driveway. Ethan looked up. So did Sophie. Expecting somebody? She asked. No, they both moved toward the window. Parked outside sat another dark SUV. Different from the one earlier. Equally unfamiliar. A man stepped out. Well-dressed. Professional. Calm. He approached the front porch carrying what appeared to be a sealed envelope. Ethan opened the door before the man reached it. Can I help you? The stranger smiled politely. Mr. Walker? Yes. My name is Daniel Brooks. He handed over the envelope. I was asked to deliver this personally. Ethan accepted it. What is it? An invitation. From who? For the first time, the man's expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not nervousness. Respect. Someone who believes she owes you a debt that cannot be measured in dollars. Ethan looked down at the envelope. No return address. No company logo. Just his name written neatly across the front. When he looked up again, the man was already returning to the vehicle. Wait, Ethan called. What is this about? The stranger paused beside the SUV and smiled. You will understand very soon. Then he drove away. Ethan remained standing on the porch long after the taillights disappeared. Behind him, Sophie looked up from the doorway. Daddy. Ethan stared at the envelope in his hands. Yeah. I think things are about to get interesting. For the first time in days, Ethan laughed. He had no idea how right she was. Ethan did not open the envelope immediately. Instead, he carried it into the kitchen and placed it on the table while Sophie watched with barely contained curiosity. Well, she asked. Well, what? Ethan replied. You are really going to pretend you are not curious? Ethan smiled despite himself. I am curious. Then open it. He finally slid a finger beneath the seal and unfolded the thick piece of paper inside. The message was surprisingly simple. Mr. Ethan Walker, please be present at Pine Hollow Town Square at 10 o'clock Saturday morning. Transportation and accommodations are not required. Your presence is respectfully requested. No further explanation followed. No company logo. No government seal. Only a handwritten signature at the bottom. Rachel Hayes. Ethan stared at the name. Sophie leaned closer. Who is Rachel Hayes? Ethan immediately recognized it. Not because she had introduced herself that way. She never had. Yet somehow he knew. I think, he said slowly. She is the woman from the bus shelter. Sophie blinked. The one you helped. Maybe. Maybe. Ethan laughed. That is the problem. I do not know. Sophie grinned. This is definitely getting interesting. The next 2 days moved painfully slowly. Pine Hollow buzzed with rumors. People noticed unfamiliar vehicles. They noticed strangers asking questions. They noticed activity that simply did not belong in a farming town of 2,000 residents. By Friday afternoon, speculation had become the town's favorite pastime. Some believed Ethan had inherited money. Others thought he had won a lawsuit. One theory suggested he was secretly related to a politician. Ethan ignored all of it. Saturday arrived bright and cold. Sunlight reflected across fresh snow, making the entire town shimmer beneath a cloudless sky. Ethan dressed in his best button-down shirt. It was not new. It was not expensive, but it was clean and carefully pressed. Sophie insisted on accompanying him. No chance I am missing this, she declared. By 9:45, Pine Hollow Town Square was already crowded. Residents gathered near storefronts and sidewalks. Conversations filled the crisp morning air. Ethan and Sophie stepped from the truck and immediately noticed something unusual. The square was quieting. Not because people had left. Because people were staring down the main road. Ethan turned. In the distance, a convoy was approaching. Large olive-green vehicles moved steadily toward town. Their polished surfaces reflected winter sunlight. They traveled in perfect formation. Not hurried. Not aggressive. Simply precise. Professional. The crowd fell silent. One vehicle entered the square. Then another. Then another. By the time the final vehicle stopped, nobody was speaking. Even children seemed frozen by the sight. Ethan felt Sophie grab his hand. Daddy, she whispered. I know. The doors opened. Uniformed personnel stepped out first. Their movements were calm and coordinated. Then a final vehicle door opened near the center of the convoy. A woman emerged. The same blonde hair. The same blue eyes. The same calm presence. Yet now she wore a formal military uniform that carried unmistakable authority. Medals caught the sunlight. Respect seemed to follow her without effort. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan stood motionless. Rachel Hayes looked across the square. Her eyes found him immediately. And then something happened that nobody expected. She smiled. Not the polite smile of an official. Not the practiced smile of a public figure. A genuine smile filled with gratitude. Rachel walked toward him. Every person in the square watched. Every conversation disappeared. Every rumor suddenly felt insignificant. When she reached Ethan, she stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence itself seemed meaningful. Finally, Rachel extended her hand. "Hello, Ethan." Ethan smiled. "Hello, Rachel." She glanced toward Sophie. "And you must be Sophie." Sophie looked surprised. "You know my name?" Rachel nodded gently. "I know quite a lot about the two of you." Sophie looked at her father. "This is officially the strangest week of my life." Several people nearby laughed softly. Even Rachel smiled. Then her expression grew more serious. She turned toward the gathered crowd. Hundreds of eyes followed her. The town square became completely silent. Rachel took a slow breath. "A week ago," she began, "I arrived in Pine Hollow under circumstances I could not explain. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. I was tired, hungry, and alone." Her eyes shifted toward Ethan. "Most people never noticed me." The silence deepened. One person did. Rachel looked directly at Ethan. "And because of that simple act of kindness, I am standing here today with a debt I can never fully repay." Across the square, people exchanged stunned looks. The woman they had ignored. The woman they had misunderstood. The woman Ethan had helped. Suddenly the story was becoming much bigger than anyone imagined. And Rachel Hayes had only just begun to tell it. The town square remained completely silent. Even the winter wind seemed quieter somehow. Rachel Hayes stood beside Ethan Walker while hundreds of residents watched, waiting for an explanation. The mystery that had consumed Pine Hollow for an entire week was finally beginning to unfold. Rachel looked across the crowd before speaking again. "Many of you saw me sitting at the bus shelter." Several people lowered their eyes immediately. Others shifted uncomfortably. They remembered. They remembered walking past. They remembered pretending not to notice. Rachel continued without judgment in her voice. "I do not blame anyone. Life is busy. People carry responsibilities. Sometimes we simply fail to see each other." Her calmness somehow made the silence even heavier. Then she turned toward Ethan. "But Ethan saw me." Sophie stood beside her father, holding his hand tightly. Her eyes never left Rachel. The woman smiled at her before continuing. "What none of you knew is that I was not traveling through Nebraska by accident." Curious murmurs moved through the crowd. Rachel waited for quiet to return. "For more than 20 years, I have served this country in various leadership and advisory roles." The words were simple, yet they instantly changed how people viewed her. "Several weeks ago, I was assigned to oversee an important federal operation involving multiple agencies and multiple states." She paused. "Part of that responsibility required me to travel extensively without public attention." Ethan listened carefully. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together. The strange vehicles. The unfamiliar faces. The questions. Rachel looked toward the convoy behind her. "During that assignment, circumstances forced me into an unexpected situation far from my scheduled route." She offered no further details. None were necessary. Communication became difficult. Transportation became uncertain. And for the first time in many years, I found myself completely alone. The crowd remained motionless. "I had resources available eventually," she continued. "But not immediately." Her eyes met Ethan's. And sometimes immediate kindness matters more than eventual solutions. A few people nodded quietly. Rachel reached into her coat pocket and removed something small. The folded note Ethan had once received. "When Ethan found me, he did not know who I was." She held up the paper. "He did not know my position." She glanced toward the crowd. "He did not know my responsibilities." Then she looked directly at Ethan again. "And he certainly did not know that multiple government offices were actively searching for me at that very moment." A wave of surprise swept through the square. Even Ethan looked stunned. Rachel smiled faintly. Yet none of that mattered to him. Her voice softened. He saw a hungry stranger. The silence returned. Deep, respectful, genuine. Rachel folded the note carefully. People often assume character is revealed during moments of success. She shook her head gently. That is not true. Her gaze moved across the crowd. Character reveals itself when there is no reward. Nobody spoke. When there are bills to pay. She looked toward Ethan. When life is difficult. She glanced at Sophie. When your own family needs every dollar you have. Then she smiled. And you choose kindness anyway. Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Not because of attention. He had never wanted attention. But because someone understood. Rachel continued. The sandwich Ethan shared with me was not simply food. Her voice remained calm. It was dignity. Several people lowered their heads. The coffee he bought was not simply coffee. A faint smile crossed her face. It was respect. She looked toward the diner where Carol stood near the entrance listening. And the conversation we shared reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. Ethan watched her carefully. What was that? He asked quietly. Rachel looked at him. That good people still exist. The answer hung in the winter air. A long moment passed before she continued. The truth is, Ethan did more than help me. Her expression grew serious. He helped me remember why service matters in the first place. The crowd listened in complete silence. Leadership can sometimes create distance. Rachel glanced toward the convoy. Titles can create barriers. She shook her head slightly. But sitting beside a father who expected nothing in return reminded me what this country is actually built upon. Her eyes moved toward Sophie. Families. Then toward Ethan. Responsibility. Finally toward the crowd. And ordinary people choosing decency when nobody is watching. The square remained perfectly still. Even those who had once mocked Ethan found themselves unable to look away. Rachel took a slow breath. Then a warm smile returned to her face. However, she said, there is one thing Ethan still does not know. Ethan frowned slightly. Sophie immediately looked excited. I knew there was more, she whispered. Several people laughed softly. Rachel nodded. Yes. Her eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. There is much more. Then she turned toward one of the vehicles behind her and gave a small signal. Instantly, several uniformed individuals began moving forward, carrying something that made the entire crowd lean closer in anticipation. The entire town leaned forward as the uniformed personnel approached, carrying a large presentation case and several folders. The sunlight reflected off the polished surface as they stopped beside Rachel. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed willing to break the moment. Rachel accepted one of the folders and turned back toward Ethan and Sophie. Before I explain this, she said, there is something else you deserve to know. Ethan glanced at Sophie, who looked as though she had forgotten how to blink. Rachel smiled gently. A few days after I left Pine Hollow, my team began reviewing information about the people who had helped me. Ethan immediately shook his head. You did not need to do that. Perhaps not, Rachel replied. But gratitude has a way of creating responsibility. Several people nodded quietly. Rachel opened the folder and looked down briefly before continuing. During that review, I learned about your wife. Ethan felt his chest tighten. The crowd became even quieter. Rachel's voice softened. I learned about the years she spent helping families in this community. I learned about the volunteer work she did when nobody was paying attention. I learned about the meals she delivered, the children she encouraged, and the lives she touched. Ethan lowered his eyes. Even now, years later, hearing someone speak about her carried a special kind of ache. Rachel continued. Most importantly, I learned that she taught her daughter something extraordinary. Sophie looked surprised. Me? Rachel nodded. Yes. Then she smiled warmly. Do not let hard times make your heart smaller. Sophie's eyes widened. Ethan looked at her in amazement. Rachel laughed softly. Your father shared those words with me at a bus shelter. A few people smiled. Others quietly wiped their eyes. Rachel took a slow breath. Those words stayed with me. She paused, and they led me to discover something remarkable. She opened the presentation case. Inside rested a framed certificate. The crowd strained to see it. Rachel carefully lifted it and turned toward Sophie. Several years ago, a scholarship fund was created in honor of your mother. Ethan stared at her. What? Rachel nodded. A small educational fund established by people whose lives she influenced. Sophie looked between them, confused. There is a scholarship with Mom's name? Rachel smiled. There is. The little girl stood speechless. Rachel held up the certificate. After reviewing applications from across multiple counties, the committee recently selected its newest recipient. A smile touched her face. Sophia Walker. For a second nobody moved. Then Sophie covered her mouth. With both hands. Ethan simply stared. The crowd erupted into applause. Not loud. Not wild. Warm. Genuine. The kind of applause that comes from the heart. Sophie looked at her father with tears in her eyes. Daddy. Ethan could not immediately answer. Rachel stepped closer and handed her the certificate. Your mother would be very proud of you. Sophie accepted it carefully, as though it might disappear if she held it too tightly. The applause slowly faded. Rachel then turned toward Ethan again. And now for the second matter. A second folder appeared. Rachel handed it to him. Ethan opened it cautiously. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. I do not understand. Rachel smiled. You will. She looked toward the crowd. One of the organizations involved in our operation maintains community development partnerships across rural America. She nodded toward Ethan. After reviewing his qualifications, experience, and recommendations from nearly everyone in this town, they have offered him a leadership position overseeing agricultural equipment support across 3 counties. A wave of surprise moved through the square. Ethan blinked. A leadership position? Rachel nodded. Full salary. Full benefits. Stable employment. Ethan looked stunned. Why? Rachel's answer came without hesitation. Because character matters. Silence followed. Deep and meaningful. Rachel continued. Machines can be repaired by many people. She glanced toward the crowd. Trust cannot. Ethan looked down at the paperwork again. The numbers alone seemed impossible. Life-changing. Enough to protect the house. Enough to provide stability. Enough to remove burdens he had carried for years. Yet Rachel was not finished. There is one final thing. The crowd laughed softly. Even Ethan smiled. There is more. Rachel laughed. Only one thing. She reached into her pocket and removed the folded note she had written days earlier. Thank you, Ethan. She held it between her fingers for a moment before speaking. People assume kindness changes the life of the person receiving it. Her eyes met Ethan's. Sometimes. Then she looked across the town square. But the truth is that kindness changes. Everyone who witnesses it. The winter sunlight bathed the square in gold. Snow sparkled on rooftops. No one spoke. No one needed to. Because for the first time, the entire town understood that a single sandwich, a cup of coffee, and a few moments of respect had created something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The applause eventually faded, but the feeling remained. People stood quietly beneath the bright Nebraska sky as though nobody wanted the moment to end. Snow glistened on rooftops. Church bells echoed faintly from across town. For years, Pine Hollow had watched Ethan Walker struggle. They had seen him work long hours. They had seen him repair tractors in freezing weather. They had seen him raise Sophie alone after losing the woman he loved. Yet somehow, only now did many of them truly see him. Rachel looked around the square one final time before turning toward Ethan. There is something I have learned during my years of service, she said softly. Titles impress people. Power impresses people. Success impresses people. She paused. But character changes people. The crowd listened carefully. Rachel smiled. And character is what I found here. Ethan shook his head. I only gave someone lunch. Rachel laughed gently. That is exactly why you still do not understand what happened. Several people smiled. Ethan looked genuinely confused. Rachel continued. You keep measuring your actions by what you gave. She touched the folded note in her hand. Everyone else is measuring them by what they revealed. The words settled over the square like fresh snowfall. Quiet. Lasting. True. Sophie stepped closer to her father and slipped her hand into his. Rachel looked down at her. Your mother left you something far more valuable than money. Sophie nodded. She taught me to be kind. Rachel smiled. Yes. Then she glanced at Ethan. And your father made sure you never forgot. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence felt different now. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Peaceful. Complete. Rachel finally stepped back and nodded toward the convoy. I should go. Several people looked disappointed. Somehow, over the course of a single morning, she had become part of the town's story. Ethan extended his hand. Thank you. Rachel shook it firmly. No, Ethan. Her eyes held genuine warmth. Thank you. Then something unexpected happened. Rachel took one step backward and raised her hand in a formal salute. The movement was precise, respectful, deeply sincere. Gasps spread quietly through the crowd. Ethan stood frozen. He had no military rank, no public office, no special title. Yet a woman entrusted with tremendous responsibility was saluting him in front of an entire town. Not because of status, not because of achievement, because of kindness. Slowly, Ethan nodded in return. Rachel lowered her hand. Neither needed additional words. Some moments speak for themselves. Minutes later, the convoy began departing. Engines started. Vehicles moved into formation. One by one, they rolled away from the town square. Residents watched until the final vehicle disappeared beyond the edge of Pine Hollow. Yet even after they were gone, nobody seemed eager to leave. Small groups lingered. Conversations resumed quietly. Not gossip this time. Reflection, understanding, gratitude. Ethan and Sophie eventually walked back toward the old pickup truck. The same truck, the same worn boots, the same father and daughter. Yet somehow everything felt different. Halfway across the square, Harold Collins approached. Then Carol from the diner. Then Mr. Jensen. One by one, people stopped Ethan. Some thanked him. Some congratulated him. Some simply shook his hand. Ethan accepted every gesture with the same humility he had always carried. Later that afternoon, after the crowds dispersed and normal life slowly returned, Ethan and Sophie sat together on the front porch. The winter sun hung low above distant fields. Golden light stretched across the snow. Sophie held the scholarship certificate carefully in her lap. Ethan looked out toward the horizon. "You know," Sophie said, "Mom would have liked Rachel." Ethan smiled. "I think so too." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think all this happened because you helped somebody?" Ethan thought about the question for a long time. The wind moved gently through nearby trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world felt calm again. Finally, he answered. "No." Sophie looked up. "No." Ethan shook his head. "I think all this happened because your mother spent years teaching us who we should be." Sophie smiled. "That sounds like her." They sat quietly for several minutes. Then Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded note. The paper had become worn from being carried every day. "Thank you, Ethan." He looked at the words one final time before carefully placing the note inside the family photo album they kept in the house. A reminder, not of recognition, not of rewards, but of a simple truth. Years later, people in Pine Hollow would still tell the story. They would remember the convoy. They would remember the uniforms. They would remember the speeches. But those details were never the most important part. The thing they remembered most was much smaller. A father with almost nothing choosing to share what little he had. Because in the end, the greatest acts of grace rarely arrive with applause. They happen quietly, one decision at a time, one person at a time. And sometimes, when the world least expects it, that quiet dignity becomes powerful enough to change everything.